This Halloween, what's under your costume might just steal the show.
Wait, is that glow-in-the-dark underwear?
Ooh, yeah. MeUndies has dropped their spookiest collection yet. Glow-in-the-dark undies and PJs so comfy, it's scary.
Tricks, treats, and buttery soft briefs.
Exactly. To get cozy and spooky for less, go to MeUndies.com/trick-or-treat and enter code trick-or-treat to get 20% off your first order. That's 20% off your first order at MeUndies.com/trick-or-treat. Code trick-or-treat. MeUndies. Treat yourself.
Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's conversation series episode is brought to you by thecollector.com. If you're into mind-blowing dives into ancient history, philosophy, killer art breakdowns, or even epic travel spots with a cultural twist, this is the site that's got it all. Visit thecollector.com, stories to teach, inform, and inspire. Today on History Shorts, I'm delighted to be joined by two esteemed brothers, Philip Taubman and William Taubman, whose combined expertise in journalism, history, and biography has produced some of the most insightful works on Cold War-era figures and events. Philip, a longtime New York Times national security correspondent, has authored acclaimed books like Secret Empire, Eisenhower, the CIA, and the Hidden Story of America's Space Espionage, while William earned the Pulitzer Prize for his masterful biography, Khrushchev, the Man and His Era. In their latest collaborative effort, McNamara at War, A New History, they draw on newly discovered diaries and untapped sources to paint a revolutionary portrait of Robert S. McNamara, from his efficiency-driven rise at Ford and the Pentagon to the moral reckonings of the Vietnam War and his later years. It's a nuanced exploration of leadership, regret, and the human cost of policy decisions that still resonate today. For past episodes in a conversation series, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. And if you like the show, please consider becoming a monthly Patreon supporter at patreon.com/History Shorts Podcast. Enjoy today's conversation.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
All right, well, Philip and Bill, welcome to History Shorts.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes, indeed.
I have an older brother myself, and all we ever do is fight and argue. And now that we're grown-ups, we don't anymore. We get together for barbecues. But how did you guys come to write a book together? And how do you think your parents would feel about this? That you sat down and you're like, let us put our collective professional careers together.
Well, I think we're sure our parents, who are long since deceased, would be thrilled by this collaboration. Since I was the instigator, I'll explain how it developed. I got started on this project in 2010, believe it or not. And was working on another book, a biography of George Shultz, the Secretary of State to Ronald Reagan. And as I was, poking along on the McNamara project on the side, suddenly occurred to me that it would be a great experience to work with Bill. So I asked him, and if he might be interested, he can tell you in a second his thoughts. He agreed. And it worked out beautifully. It turns out that we have very similar writing voices. So people who've been reading the book or read it in galley form tell us they can't figure out where one of us stopped writing and the other picked up. And we've always gotten along well. I guess since the moment when I was probably 6 or 7 years old. I forget how old, and Bill was still living at home. I think he was a graduate student. I forget the exact details, but I was angry at him. I went into his room with a crayon or piece of chalk and scrawled on his closet door, "Billy is silly." And I thought that was devastating for him. Ever since then, it's been a wonderful relationship.
What I would add, you might be interested in this.
My wife and I have a dear Russian emigre friend who predicted that Phil and I, having embarked on this project, would inevitably quarrel. I think this was a projection of Russian life in which there's so much quarreling. But at any rate, we did not quarrel. And maybe that's a reflection of the American culture.
So your book, guys, draws on newly discovered diaries, letters, poetry, things that shed light on McNamara's inner thoughts. What do you think was the most surprising revelation from these personal records about his decision-making and just about him? And how do you think those things challenge the existing perceptions of him as a cold, efficiency-driven technocrat?
Bill?
Well, I might say that to me, and the most surprising thing was that this guy, whom Senator Barry Goldwater described as a computer with legs, a cold, aloof technocrat, turned out in part of his life and part of his self to be a warm, emotional man who was filled with, it turned out, doubt about what he was doing. And it eventually formed into a kind of opposition to the very war that he was identified as the leader of. I mean, he seemed to be the prime spokesman for the war, the fierce advocate of escalation of the war, the man who presided over the killing of thousands of Americans and millions, as it turned out, of Vietnamese without a qualm, but he was filled with doubt. And that played a role in the way the war developed and in his own life.
So, the things that surprised me, Bill, I think, has captured very well a kind of overview. The specific things that startled me, one you alluded to yourself, was that he was a lover of poetry. That seemed out of character to the Robert McNamara that I understood to be when I was, viewing him as a American unhappy with the Vietnam War. Another thing that I think we weave into the book was this improbable relationship he had with Jacqueline Kennedy, that began while she was in the White House and then they seemed to grow close after her husband was assassinated. So there's this kind of inner quality of McNamara that I think we came to at least see and hopefully understand a bit more than previous biographers had an opportunity to do.
What kind of poetry was he into? If you can maybe share with our listeners, what do you think that speaks or says about him?
In the opening of the book, I have a copy here. There are two poems that we have that are really interesting because they show different sides of his character. They're short, so I think I'll read them if you don't mind. They're just
Perfect.
A stanza for each one. So one is Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. I'll read this excerpt. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. The other is a Dylan Thomas poem, The Hand That Signed the Paper. And here's an excerpt from that. The hand that signed a paper felled a city. 5 sovereign fingers taxed the breath, doubled the globe of dead and halved a country. These 5 kings did a king to death.
He collected these. He had like a scrapbook.
He did, and we got a copy of it along the way. And he presented it to people he felt close to, including Jackie Kennedy. I have to say, to give an alternative perspective on this, when I asked Sally Quinn, the former Washington Post reporter, about the poetry, she said, "Oh gosh, that's one of the oldest gambits in the book. When guys try to show that they have a heart, they show women that they're chasing poetry."
I would put it somewhat differently. It seems to me that the poems that McNamara collected often revealed sentiments that he secretly held himself, but was reluctant to publicize lest they be seen as signs of weakness.
The one thing that kind of got me too is McNamara is often portrayed as a man who loved efficiency, right? And was undone by the chaos of war. How do we reconcile his pre-war successes in business and government with his later regrets? And what does this duality reveal about human limits of rational leadership in times of crisis? I mean, this is a guy that really had it together. And then it seems like things unraveled for him once he was faced with this crisis.
Well, the Vietnam experience that he had differed drastically from the experiences he had as he climbed the ladder to success. I mean, he stood out as an undergraduate at Berkeley. He was one of 3 undergraduates to be named to Phi Beta Kappa in his junior year, 3 out of 3,000. And at Harvard Business School, he was the smartest one. He ranked number 1 at Harvard Business School. Well, Harvard Business School isn't war. So in that sense, it was an easier climb. Now, the next experience was World War II. And here he did come closer, much closer to blood and guts and death. And in fact, at one point toward the end of the war, working in the Pacific for General Curtis LeMay, he helped to plan the firebombing of Tokyo that killed 100,000 Japanese. And that turned out to be something that he secretly regarded as a war crime. He even said, if we had lost the war, I would have been convicted as a war criminal. So there you get his exposure to blood and death. But then there's a reprieve. The Ford Motor Company, after the war, he rises to the top, becomes the only non-member of the Ford family to be president of Ford Company, and then immediately thereafter is called by President Kennedy to Washington to be Secretary of Defense. So what I'm saying is he had a much easier experience before the war in Vietnam. Even in the Defense Department, for the first 3 years, it was a kind of cakewalk. He was reorganizing the Pentagon, but that too was not blood and guts and death. Vietnam was a different experience, and it kind of overwhelmed him, even as he seemed to manage it as efficiently as everything else.
Yeah, Bill, one other aspect of that I think is worth noting is that his rise on the civilian side was heavily dependent on his mastery of data and statistics. He was instrumental in building a bookkeeping system at Ford, an accounting system which actually they didn't have when he and his colleagues arrived right after the war. So his whole life had revolved around the management, manipulation, analysis of data. Then we get to Vietnam, and I think where he went in the wrong direction right from the outset was relying on data. And the data that was coming in from the field, especially, once Lyndon Johnson became president and we had committed tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of American troops to Vietnam, the data was coming in was misleading. Some of it was doctored by those who put it together. Some of it was just their own misunderstanding about how data might reflect success on the battlefield. So McNamara is sitting in Washington looking at all the body counts coming in and all the data. And I think for a while that led him to the naive belief that our intervention in Vietnam was on the right track. So he was a kind of a prisoner of data, and it turned out the data that he was getting about Vietnam gave him a totally misleading picture of what was happening.
Can we pinpoint a moment or point to a moment where it all unraveled in McNamara, the successful businessman politician, and then McNamara, who becomes the scapegoat? Can we find that one moment where things turned for him?
Yeah, there are a number of moments, I would say. Clearly, by late 1965, he has come to recognize that the statistics about Vietnam are misleading. And this is just now a few months after he's been a vehement supporter of escalation. The pivotal figure at the meetings in the summer of 65, after which Johnson decided to make it an American war and commit, tens of thousands of American troops. Apparently, the best we can tell, as time went on, McNamara made many visits to Vietnam, and he began to see that the data was not giving him an accurate picture. So by late 65, he says in his own book, in retrospect, that was published in 1995, he's beginning to realize that the war is probably unwinnable militarily on the strategy that we're pursuing. Certainly by the spring of 66, it's clear he's come to that conclusion. And from then on, in the remaining months, it's 19 months, I think, of his tenure as defense secretary, he is trying to persuade Johnson to de-escalate, but he's never trying to persuade Johnson to withdraw and end the war. And it's in that crucible of mid-65 to mid-66 that this kind of realization settles in. And from then on, he becomes a kind of tormented man, as Bill and I say in the book. He's not only at war in Vietnam, he's at war with himself.
Yeah, it seems like he's heavily depressed.
Yes, he's really living, as we learned to say, two lives. He's both a fierce proponent of the war, or so it seems to listen to his speeches, but he's a secret opponent of the war, to judge by the times that he breaks into tears and seems sad and depressed. I wanted to quote one line that we quote in the book, which comes in April 66. He is talking to his chief Pentagon aide, John McNaughton, who keeps a secret diary, which we got hold of later on. And in April 66, he says to McNaughton, "I want to get the troops out of there so badly that I can hardly stand it."
In 66, there are these really peculiar speeches that he gives. And people who were following him closely detected the turnabout from those speeches. So the first one, I believe, is an address he makes at his daughter's commencement in the spring. And there's a big anti-war protest at the commencement, and they had to move the commencement off campus because of that. And he gives a speech that might have been written by an English professor, at the school. It's full of literary references. It's, it is a kind of philosophical address. And then he goes up to Montreal and delivers a speech that is really striking, because the point of it is that American influence around the world cannot effectively be exercised through military power, but rather through the influence of, our history, our culture. It's kind of a preview of the soft power idea that Joe Nye, a well-known Harvard professor, developed. That the power of America is not its weapons. The power of America is its culture, its success economically, and as a model of democracy. And two Washington columnists who were widely read at the time, Mary McGrory in the Washington Post and James Reston in the New York Times, read the text of that speech and both wrote columns talking about the real Robert McNamara has emerged. And it's basically clear that he has an attitude about defense and military interventions that's quite different from the American intervention in Vietnam.
I think history often blames him, and historiography since blames him for the fact that he didn't act upon any of these things, any of these instincts that you guys, this personal dichotomy, I guess, that you guys mentioned in the book.
I think the first thing to say is that it's remarkable that he went as far as he did go in recognizing his mistakes. If you read his memoir in retrospect, it was published in 1995, it's full of self-criticism. And I can't think of another memoir by an American leader which is as self-critical as McNamara's. So that's the first point. But then there are reasons why he didn't go farther. And on those, I might ask Phil.
So, yes, let me first offer a set that I think he would cite. He does cite to some extent in his defense. And I think you have to understand that these are all part of it. The biggest reason, which I'll get to in a minute, was a kind of distorted sense of loyalty to Lyndon Johnson. But before I touch on that, I think he truly believed in the domino theory at the time, namely that if South Vietnam lost the war, communism would wash across Southeast Asia. He actually thought it might go well beyond that and infect Japan, India, Malaysia, even ultimately potentially India, Greece, Turkey, he said, and Africa. And they were all believers in the domino theory. So I think that accounted for it. Secondly, I think he was concerned and said so that if he were to oppose the war publicly, equip the administration, it would give aid and comfort to the enemy. And lastly, he persuaded himself that if he left, someone might take the job who was less interested in trying to de-escalate than he was, and would not stand in the way of a massive escalation that would involve a ground invasion of North Vietnam that might lead to a conflict with China or Russia and a nuclear war. And both he and Johnson were eager to avoid that. So those would be the reasons he would give in his own defense. But the real reason, I think, was this distorted sense of loyalty. And he talked about it in an interview with Life magazine just a couple of months after he left the Pentagon. And in that interview, he was asked specifically, "Why did you stay?" And he said, loyalty to the president. And the interviewer pressed him on that and said, "Well, isn't there a higher loyalty in Washington?" To which McNamara essentially said, "That's baloney, that's bunk." He even went so far as to say that if we were to fall under the spell of this notion that there's some kind of higher loyalty, it would unravel our democracy. That the president is elected by the people. His cabinet members are obliged to follow his orders or quit, he might have said, but basically follow the orders. And the conversation with the Life correspondent seemed entirely oblivious to the oath of office that he took. Like other cabinet members, he placed his right hand on a Bible and swore to defend the Constitution of the United States. And there's not a word in that oath about the President of the United States.
Your book is a very personal look into McNamara. My last question is, who was Robert McNamara? Not the politician that we think of when we think of the media or history, but the man behind the facade.
Well, we start the book with his childhood, and we trace his career up. He becomes Secretary of Defense. And the reason we do that is we want to try to understand the evolution of this man. And we notice, for example, that his parents profoundly shaped his character. His father was cold and aloof. His mother pressed him to excel and was a kind of helicopter mother in a pre-helicopter age. Pushed him. If he brought home an A from school, she let him know that she expected an A+. When he was at Harvard Business School, becoming a grown-up man with great attributes, she wrote him letters which combined a kind of petty tutelage with almost worship. On the one hand, he had divine guidance. On the other hand, he had to be told to wear his overcoat because it was cold. And I think this kind of combination of parenting produced somebody who was driven to excel, but was also plagued by a kind of self-doubt. And that's what we see developing later on in life, precisely those qualities. High, vaulting ambition on the one hand, and on the other hand, uncertainty about what he is doing.
I think the McNamara that surprised us, that was different from the McNamara that most Americans think of when they think of him, is the McNamara who had tremendous inner stress, who was profoundly insecure, rather than being the man who appeared to be totally self-confident, almost ruthlessly arrogant in his views, that underneath that was churning a kind of furnace of emotion and stress. And that stress was evident early on when he was at Ford. He developed a severe case of grinding his teeth when he slept, so much so that when the dentist in Michigan prescribed, this will strike people as a kind of irony, there he is in the automobile capital of the country, the dentist said, you need to get a piece of tire tread and put it in your mouth at night, and that will prevent your, grinding. Well, he did, and he ground right through the tire tread. So, that's evidence of a man. Now we're talking, this is the late 40s and the 50s before he goes to Washington. He is a man feeling a tremendous stress. And I think the reason for that is partly this notion of I have to excel, I have to succeed. That was kind of baked into him by his mother, but doubts every step of the way whether he could actually achieve that goal.
Now that you've written this book, do you have another one that you're thinking of?
Well, I think this is, something to be discussed. Bill asked me about this about a year ago, I think, and I proffered an idea that took me back to my days as a sports writer for both Time Magazine and Esquire. And I could see that Bill was lukewarm about the idea. So, we will have further conversations.
What does your family say about this? When you guys get together, do you talk shop or do you try to avoid talking shop?
No, we certainly talk shop. I think the family objection, at least in my case, probably comes from my wife, who is herself a retired professor of Russian language, literature, and film at Amherst College. So she's done her bit in the groves of academia, but I think she's had it with my disappearing for most days up to the third floor to work on a book. We are now old enough, I think, that we need to help each other get on with the rest of our lives.
Speaking for my family, my wife is a writer, journalist. She's sympathetic, but I think, our two sons who are adults at this point are kind of bemused, that dad keeps plugging away at these books.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This was a great interview. I really appreciate your insight. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Beautiful Anonymous changes each week. It defies genres and expectations. For example, our most recent episode, I talked to a woman who survived a murder attempt by her own son. But just the week before that, we just talked the whole time about Star Trek. We've had other recent episodes about sexting in languages that are not your first language, or what it's like to get weight loss surgery. It's unpredictable, it's real, it's honest, it's raw. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.